Oh, already? Good morning. Thank you for joining us at the California Board of Occupational Therapy on Friday, December 9th, 2016. The time is 9:11, and if we could have roll call, please.
Richard Bookwalter here. Jeff Farrow.
Present.
Laura Haith.
Here.
Teresa Davies.
Here.
Denise Miller.
Here.
Beata Dragomorkos.
Here.
Sharon Pavlovich, absent. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Do we have any public items or public comments that are not on the agenda? We do have new public members who are with us today. As always, it is optional for you to introduce yourself. There is no pressure, but if you would like to introduce yourself, if you could just, for those of you who've been here, please by all means introduce yourself again if you're so willing. For our new, if you are willing, please just give a little nod and we'll make sure. And if you don't want to, there's no pressure there either. So if we could go to our public, please, for introduction.
Altamura with Capital Advocacy on behalf of
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Pam Richardson, occupational therapist on behalf of NBC OT. The rest of us reintroduced in here?
Sure.
Heather Kitching, OTAG president.
Chuck Wilmarth, Director of State Affairs AOTA.
Sean Conway, Senior Director of External and Regulatory Affairs with NBC OT.
Sharon Jones, ACA Board and Bureau Relations.
Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is a presentation by Sean Conway, Director of Credentialing Services for the National Board of Certification of Occupational Therapy, Incorporated, on NBC OT Navigator, online continuing competency assessment tools. Sean, if you would like to.
And before we get started, I just wanted to make sure I adhere to our timelines. So do you want me, Heather, to finish, in terms of about an hour, or what would be best?
Probably a little bit less than that.
A little less, yep. Absolutely, okay. So if we finish around 10, does that sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good deal. Okay.
Oh, that's true. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to move down. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to stay. Okay. Just on the end? Feel free to start, Sean. I'm coming.
Okay, all right. Well, good morning, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here to share this information with you, and I want to thank the board for inviting and having NBC OT here this morning to talk with you about the NBC OT Navigator. And Heather, I want to thank you and your staff for all the efforts that each of you make to help coordinate this visit. So we really do appreciate that. Thank you. In terms of the presentation this morning, we are here to focus specifically on the NBC OT Navigator. So that is what the board asked us to talk about, and so that's really what we're going to keep our discussion focused on. Let's see here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why we're here. We know that the board extended the invitation, and in terms of discussion around the NBC OT Navigator, these are some key points of clarification that are important to share with everyone. In terms of the NBC OT Navigator, we want to provide information to the board about these new tools, and knowing that they are optional tools. So, point of clarification is that we're not in any way asking for regulatory boards across the country to require these tools. We are asking for the board's consideration to accept these as a potential option amongst all of the other kinds of professional development activities that we know regulatory boards already accept. These tools are available to OTR and COTA certificates. So one of the other points of clarification is that this initiative was put forward, supported by the board of directors, as a value-added proposition to national certification status. So that, for example, if an OTR or COTA certificant says to themselves, what's in this for me, this national certification? This is something that has now been developed, steeped in current evidence. It has been a project, an initiative that's literally been 4.5 to 5 years in the making, and is now available to all individuals who maintain certification status. It's an online tool, so it's available 24 hours a day to individuals all over the country, and as well to OTR and COTA certificates who may live outside of the United States. So as long as they have maintained their certification, they too have access to these tools. This is but one type of tool in addition to all of the other kinds of tools that NBC OT recognizes for its own certification renewal purposes, and or state regulatory boards recognize for continuing education or continuing competency purposes. So that's a really important point of clarification. In the case of NBC OT, we have 29 different types of professional development activities that a certificant can elect to choose from in terms of how they want to meet their certification renewal requirement. What kind of combination, what type of activity is going to work best for him or for her? So these tools, please know, they may not be for everybody. It's a type of tool that's available to the OTR and COTA certificate population. And in specific reference to state regulatory boards' consideration of the tools, it's also important to note that the discussion is around partial fulfillment. So in other words, this is a type of tool. If the regulatory board considers accepting this as a type of tool, it is with the understanding that it would be in partial fulfillment of meeting the state's continuing education or competency requirement. So does that all, in terms of sort of laying the groundwork and sort of really hitting on some of those key points of clarification, does that all make sense? Are there any questions that anyone has? Okay. And if you think of something, as we go along, please, by all means, ask. Because I'm so glad that everybody's here, in the sense that we want to make sure that folks are hearing directly from NBC OT, so that you receive the information directly from the source. And if you have questions, I always invite people to ask questions. That's what this is for. It's about helping to share the information, helping to make people aware of these tools as a resource, as an optional resource. Folks don't have to use them. It's at their discretion. Okay. So, in terms of the organization's mission, you'll see here that the mission really incorporates professional practice through evidence-based certification standards. And that is critical to everything that NBC OT does. Everything the organization does is linked to evidence-based certification standards. And we're going to talk more about this initiative and how specifically the organization approached it through evidence-based certification standards. Because that's really important in terms of understanding the validity of what's behind these tools, the extent of what went on to actually develop these tools from an evidence-based perspective. So we all know, in terms of NBC OT's renewal requirement, that it consists of 36 units within a 3-year cycle, that there is a renewal application process, and that is very similar to some of the discussion, I think, during yesterday's meeting, in terms of the application and the attestation statement, and, all the kinds of things that come along with that. And so, I think in terms of regulatory boards, you all have a very good sense, a great sense of appreciation of the kinds of issues that come up with this part of the process. In terms of NBC OT's renewal data, it's helpful, I think, to know that as we talk about these tools as a resource available to certificants who have maintained their certification, that since 2002, there has been an average renewal rate of 90%. That's an aggregate renewal percentage between OTR and COTA certificates. If we want to kind of pare that down to a year, we can look at, for example, the year 2016. Now, we know we're not quite finished with the year, but to date, the renewal rate for the cohort that was due to renew in 2016 is 97% for the OTR cohort and 90% for the COTA cohort. So there again, just to give you some perspective, you have sort of that national aggregate rate since 2002 and what that looks like, and then you have an example of what the renewal rate looks like in the current year. Background in terms of this initiative. Linking back to that mission statement. So this is the part of the presentation that really is going to give you the background and the insight into what has gone on and really what has gone into this entire project. In 2012, NBCOT initiated a national practice analysis study. Now, we're all, I think, familiar with the fact that there is an entry-level practice analysis study that typically is done related to the certification examination. And that study is looking at entry-level practice. Typically, folks involved in that study are individuals who've been 1 to 3 years into practice. And what does that look like? In this case, and this is significant because this is the first time that a certification renewal practice analysis study has ever been done. And in this case, the average number of years of folks who were certified, who participated in this study, was 12 years. So you can see that in terms of what that study is looking at, it's a different cohort based on different experiences. This initiated based on the Institute of Medicine reports that came out in the early 2000s. And I think for most, if not all of us, we know that those reports really challenged all health professions, not just occupational therapy, but all health professions, really challenged us all in terms of looking at continuing competence. And how do we start moving that pendulum further down the pike, beyond what continuing education traditionally looks like? What are the kinds of things that each of the professions can be doing? How can we push ourselves to move in a direction that starts to really look at knowledge and skill across a practitioner's lifespan, and how we can, from an evidence-based perspective, support and enhance that, make that stronger, lead to better outcomes? So it's that baseline study in the early 2000s that led to our board of directors ultimately making the decision to try to move in this direction. The goals of the practice analysis study were such that ultimately the results are looking at what are practitioners actually doing in practice. Not what we think they are doing, but when the rubber hits the road and people are out there every day and they're faced with all kinds of challenges that we're all faced with every day, and they have to make those decisions, what are practitioners actually doing? The board wanted to proceed in this direction based on a national study so that ultimately we could provide an individualized kind of experience for the end user. There were 2,500 certificates that were involved in this process, and that consisted of occupational therapists registered and certified occupational therapy assistants. It's also important to know that employers and regulators were involved in this study. So, I want to always share that those various perspectives were represented at the table. Anyone who's been involved in research, I think, can appreciate the fact that a 76% response rate is a very, very strong response. And we were just elated to have such a strong participation rate. And as I mentioned earlier, the average number of years of folks who were certified involved in this process was around 12 years. So the study was conducted in 2012, and by the end of the year, the study was completed. So we started analyzing the results, which really laid the foundation for this entire initiative. And these are the things that really started to rise to the top. The results of that study identified major practice domains for both OTR and COTA certificates. There was a lot of information around providing client-centered care, working in interprofessional teams. So not just looking at, you'll see on a number of those things, not just looking at what was occurring within occupational therapy specific, but within that broader realm of healthcare service delivery. Interprofessional teams. Utilizing informatics. We all know how quickly technology is moving and the impact that that's having on practice. Applying quality improvement. All the challenges that practitioners are faced with. What are the kinds of decisions? What are the kinds of things that have to be implemented from a quality improvement perspective? So these are the things that really rose to the top and that, as I said, led to the foundation of this initiative. So another way of looking at this and emphasizing the fact that all of these issues really targeted us in moving toward what is now known as the NBC OT Navigator. Those are the elements of the study that drove this initiative. So we looked at all those results, and we then found ourselves in a position of looking at the possibility of exploring an incredible opportunity. And our board of directors ultimately decided that that opportunity would move in the direction of a virtual platform. Now, why? Why virtual? Why did the board ultimately decide to move in that direction? In terms of the virtual platform, it is very accessible. It's engaging. Each of these tools has been developed so that there is a customized user experience. We can have 3 folks who take the same tool, but the outcomes of that experience are going to be very different based on what the user puts into the system. The board chose this virtual platform in an effort to help support certificates throughout their practitioner lifespan. So thinking about the long haul, thinking about looking at professional development across a practitioner's lifespan. thinking about how to make this kind of information, these sorts of tools available, no matter whether you are a first-year practitioner or you've been in practice for 30 years, no matter whether you've been in a rural setting or you're in an urban acute care hospital, no matter whether you're in California or you're in a state like Wyoming. So thinking about all of those kinds of perspectives. The board wanted to try to develop a tool that provided people with really constructive feedback and that, very importantly, is based on current evidence. Very, very important. All of these tools based on current evidence. So in terms of the collection, the toolkit, there are numerous different types of tools that are now available to an OTR or COTA certificate. And you will see that the two physical agent modalities and management clinic that have asterisks next to them are tools that are currently being developed and will soon be forthcoming. So that's one of the points of clarification, is to know that as NBC OT moves forward, the board has really committed to this initiative for the long haul. And there is an ongoing effort to develop new tools, to continue to go back and review current tools from a content perspective. All of these tools, in terms of the development, have been beta tested. All of these tools have had psychometric analysis done. And all of these tools have ongoing content review to ensure their validity and to ensure their appropriateness and effectiveness with what professional development needs exist with practitioners today. So there is that constant review process in motion. So let's look at each one of these real quickly. The mini practice quizzes, they consist of about 20 questions, and they're very similar to a multiple choice test type format. The OT Knowledge Library. These tools assess broad areas of knowledge and practice, and they are really set up in a way in which an individual can challenge him or herself on more of an immediate recall. So there's information that comes at them quickly, and they have to match knowledge to what current practice looks like. So that's kind of a different type of experience. The Pico Tool. This tool was specifically developed to help people, in a nutshell, it was really developed to help people understand how to better develop an effective evidence-based question. That's really the essence of this particular tool. And from a practical perspective, think about how many folks came through the education experience when evidence-based practice wasn't emphasized in the way that it is today. A tool like this could potentially be very useful in helping them to better understand how to develop that kind of question and that approach. That's just one example, but it's from a day-to-day practical perspective, that's how this kind of tool could be useful. The simulation tools. These tools are really all about problem solving. It's really all about having an individual respond to, problem solve around a case scenario that is presented to them. The kinds of questions, the kinds of challenges that OT practitioners are faced with every day, and how best to respond to achieve the best outcomes. The most recent type of tool that's been made available is the Orthotic Builder. And the essence of that is to really help provide information around optimal choice in orthotic devices as well as fabrication. That's really the essence of these types of tools. So what we'll do now is take a look at a short video that will give you more information, and this video really, in terms of setting this up, focuses on an individual who's involved in a rural type of setting, in a rural practice. And so you'll be able to see in a more practical way how these kinds of tools can be put to use.
Working as an OTR is so rewarding. I love what I'm doing. I'm happy I found a job that's a good fit for me. However, sometimes it's a challenge being the only OTR in a rural area. I don't have a team of professionals nearby to bounce off ideas, and it can be hard sometimes to know about the latest evidence-based therapy to provide to my clients. Working in a rural area, I have a mixed caseload. Just today, I provided services to a child with sensory processing problems, fabricated a splint for an adult with carpal tunnel syndrome, and taught cognitive strategies to a teenager who has had a TBI. I enjoy the challenge, but I need tools to stay on top of my game. I remember hearing about the NBC OT Navigator during my OT program. Let me take a look. Seems like there's a comprehensive suite of tools to help me assess my competencies in a whole range of practice areas. I think I'll start with the self-reflection tool. This will generate a list of specific competency assessment tools related to my current practice. Tomorrow I'm going to visit a family with an infant who has feeding difficulties. I remember from OT classes that early intervention needs to address the entire family. I wonder if there are any competency assessment tools in the Navigator that could help me prepare for this visit. There is a case simulation on early intervention. Let me check this out. Wow, this tool is really tapping into my clinical reasoning skills associated with family-centered practice. I think this one is correct. This one is definitely not right, and this one too. Wait a minute, I think this one is actually correct. I'll resort these. Look at that, a list of key readings right at my fingertips. Specific journal articles about family-centered practice that I can easily access through ProQuest. By using this tool, it's confirmed the skills I currently have on infant feeding techniques and helped me to further understand the value of family-centered practice. I wonder if the NBC OT Navigator has any tools about TBI cases. This is great! There are 2 TBI cases that show a realistic progression of recovery over time when played in sequence. I know I need to complete a home assessment with my home care client. It looks like TBI-1 covers this. It has a module that covers home assessment and modification recommendations. By using this tool, it's going to help me prepare for my home visit today. That home visit went very well. I was able to identify several home modifications for the client. While I was at the client's home, the client indicated a goal of becoming more independent with meal preparation tasks. I think we should work on that during the next visit. I wonder if the NBC OT Navigator has tools to help assess my skills with observing clients during structured ADL tasks. Looks like this next case simulation tool shows a similar client to mine. The simulated client needs less physical support than my client, but requires specific cueing approaches to promote metacognitive success during task completion. I'm going to work through this case simulation to help me prepare for my next client visit. Wow, the critical event decision-making in this case simulation really got my attention. It reinforced the importance of providing important cues without overwhelming the client with too much information. I noticed in the NBC OT Navigator that there was a case simulation tool on mental health. Let me check this out.
Yeah, that's what I want. I really want to find a job. Do you think you could help me with that? You know I have a criminal history. I don't think anyone will hire me because I have done time. Nobody wants to hire a criminal. That would be good.
It's really fascinating that by using this tool, I'm able to observe the client's verbal responses and then reflect back on his presentation and the content of his statements without the audio. This really helped me to better interpret his condition. Completing this tool has helped me fine-tune my observation skills. I feel ready. I had experience fabricating orthoses on my fieldwork. It would be good to review the specific orthosis required for carpal tunnel syndrome. Orthotic Builder in the NBC OT Navigator has this covered. Let me take a look. Working through the Select All Required Action sections highlighted many critical steps that I need to prepare for. I'm gathering some excellent information after completing the tools in the Navigator. The recommended readings will help me provide the best practice for my clients. There's a lot of articles here. How do I know which ones are the best evidence to support therapy for my clients? I think the Pico Tool and Navigator help me determine the best levels of evidence to support my practice. The Pico process is really starting to make sense to me. Using the tools in the Navigator has really helped me assess my practice skills and provided me with some really great resources for my continued professional growth and development. I'm going to share the news about Navigator tools with my peers when I connect with them on social media. I'm going to continue to use Navigator throughout my career to enhance my OT practice.
Okay. So that, the video, the intent there is to kind of give you a sense of what the user experience would be like when he or she sits down to use a number of different types of tools. A couple of points of clarification that I think are important to note. With regard to the practice analysis, there is a practice analysis executive summary, which I have here, if any of you want to take a look at this. So this is right here. Also, I do want to share that, because we always try to mention this, and that is that these tools are a type of tool that in no way NBC OT ever developed or prepared with the idea that they would be recognized or accepted by state regulatory boards in any kind of exclusivity. So the intent has always been that if another organization or a company, national association, state association, employer, professional development provider, that sort of thing, if any other entity develops tools that are similar to this or even beyond in terms of the kind of technology that could be made available to certificants, that would always be recognized potentially and accepted potentially by regulatory boards. So, we always try to factor that into our discussion as well. We've never otherwise indicated anything like that in any of our verbal messaging and presentations and or anything in writing. So we just want to make sure that point too is clear. In terms of the case simulation component that you just saw in the video, we are really, really proud of the fact, really excited, totally jazzed about the fact that NBC OT has received 2 national awards. We are so psyched about this because these national awards have bestowed this honor way beyond our walls. These are organizations that, in terms of the first organization, really look at gaming as a way to enhance knowledge, to enhance that kind of experience. The second organization is an organization that includes members such as the American Dental Association, Microsoft, Facebook, etc. And that award was really geared toward the innovation that was behind these tools and really recognizing NBC OT for the fact that in healthcare, this is a type of tool that really is trend-setting. It is very innovative, and it provides the user with a very dynamic, more customized type of experience. So we are very, very excited about this. There also is a third potential award that we were notified about, 3 or 4 weeks ago, whereby NBC OT has been identified as a top contender for a national award. We have not been made aware of what the outcome of that is, but there's another organization that has also taken note of this. And I can tell you from a first-hand basis that not only have we been having these discussions from an educational perspective with state regulatory boards, but we've also been having these kinds of discussions with other organizations, meetings where folks are attending from many, many different types of professions, and the response has been incredible. Folks are very interested in this. They're really interested, very curious in terms of, you know, how could this then apply to their own profession? How could they develop and make something like this useful for the folks that they work with as well? So, in terms of the evidence-based resources, you know, we've chatted a bit about that, and certainly the video really reinforces the fact that all of these tools are linked to current evidence. And that's one of the things I think that really makes these tools stand out. All of those literature sources are pulled through these national evidence-based databases, ProQuest and RefWorks. And for folks who are in education, I mean, you know, in terms of your role as an educator, that oftentimes educators will have access to those kinds of databases. Individuals can purchase access, but it is not cheap. And so here's another example of what NBC OT is working to do to try to enhance value, trying to enhance value of certification. What is there? What is available to OTR and COTA certificates that they can really use from a practical perspective, that can lead to enhanced knowledge and skill, competency development? So those tools are pulled from these databases, and one of the things that I think is important for regulatory boards to be aware of is that there are course descriptions and assessment objectives for each one of these tools. So for example, if a board were to choose to accept these tools as an option, and they needed documentation from a licensee that confirms or provides more information about what this type of tool is, these documents are available. They're publicly available, and there's a description and an objective for every one of the tools. There also are certificates of completion that are generated once an individual successfully completes one or more of the tools. And each of the tools has a minimum threshold that the certificate has to meet in order to successfully complete the tool. But this certificate is automatically uploaded into another database that certificates can retrieve and access at any time if they need. So if they need to print it off, to submit it to an employer, to a regulatory board, or they just want to have it for whatever reason, they're able to do that. It populates up into this system, and there also is another system which is voluntary, and it's for logging professional development units. So a certificate can access the renewal logging system for any type of professional development that he or she has accrued. It doesn't have to be related to NBC OT at all. Whatever they've accrued, they can log it through this system if they so choose. That way, if they want to print out the log, use it for employment, maybe the hospital you work in is going through accreditation and your employer wants to have that in their files, you know, that's a practical way to be able to provide it very quickly, very succinctly, and easily. So just to know that there are basically two different systems, one for uploading the certificate of completion for the Navigator, the other is the renewal log for any type of professional development. This is actually a new part of this initiative. One of the things that NBC OT has done is that we wanted to start looking at what the aggregate data looks like behind use of these tools. What are the kinds of tools that are being used most frequently? What are the kinds of outcomes? What are people saying in terms of, will this make a difference? Do they think this could contribute to increasing better outcomes? So there has been a 2-year study that the University of Florida has been working on. It's an independent study They are about 1 year through the 2-year cycle. And these are some of the preliminary results that are coming out of the study. So with this phase, about 80% of the participants said the tools had helped to identify areas to improve clinical knowledge. And about 81% said those tools had helped to identify areas to improve clinical skills. 52% said the tools had helped to modify their professional development. So at the end of the day, are they going back and making modifications to how they deliver services? And nearly half now say that they are considering to use more evidence-based approaches in their practice. So nearly half of the respondents have obtained copies of the evidence-based resources, and again, that's out of ProQuest and RefWorks. Those are the resources that are made available to the user once they complete their tool. It pulls automatically through those systems. 73% read at least one of those resources. And oftentimes when a user completes those tools, there could be many resources that are provided, that are made available to the user. And remember that those databases are being updated constantly. They consist of thousands of literature sources. So the literature is as current as it can be. 93% said the resources were either useful or extremely useful, and about 89% say they were likely or extremely likely to apply what they had learned into practice. So approximately a quarter of those respondents conducted a literature search using the search terms provided. 80% read at least one of the resources. 81% said the evidence-based resources were useful or extremely useful, and 79% were likely or extremely likely to apply what they learned in practice. Oops, sorry about that. Oh. Hang on a sec. We're just about finished here. So there was only one more slide there at the end. And basically what we were summarizing with the very last slide is the fact that there are about 15,000 individuals, there are close to 16,000 individuals who have used the tools to date. And so we're very, very excited about that kind of response. And to date, there are about 31 states that have thus far, state regulatory boards that have thus far accepted the Navigator tools. So with that in closing, the question that we are putting forth before each of the boards is whether or not, again, the board would consider recognizing or accepting the tools as a activity type, as one of the different types of options available to its licensees. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those questions now. Yeah,
So it seems as if this is a type of continuing education activities.
Yeah.
I mean, you're issuing the CAU. What does the CAU
Yeah.
mean? And what is it? How does it differ from or
Yeah.
a PDU?
Yeah. So the question here is a CAU reference to these types of tools. The CAU refers to a competency assessment unit, and that name was given to these tools because of the fact that they are competency assessment tools. each one of the elements is an actual assessment, and it's all based on a self-reflection that's done at the beginning of the process.
And then you're assigning numbers to them and then saying they're okay for the 36.
That is correct.
So that is a time-related unit or an effort-related unit or both? Or
It's an effort-related unit. And so in terms of,
supposedly equivalent to one, is one CAU supposedly one PEU in your system?
yes, yeah. Now, there is a limit in terms of the number of units that a practitioner can accrue for NBC OT certification renewal purposes, and that is a limit of 14 units. So 14 units can be accrued and applied toward a 3-year renewal cycle.
We're going to take questions
Oh,
from up
Yeah,
here if we
because
may.
it's easier to,
Absolutely.
for our,
Microphones.
yeah, we have microphones, you have cameras. You don't want to do the camera swinging around the room thing.
Viewers will be all,
Any questions from the board?
Sure. Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
And first of all, I'm very impressed with the tool. I think the ease of use and the breadth of information you have is just quite impressive. So kudos to you on that. I'm curious about how the decisions were made just on the expansion of the knowledge base. It seemed that the tool is obviously focused on more of a practice area issue, but as a professional development, are there other areas of subject matter that you're exploring, perhaps like a regulatory process for practitioners or other areas?
I see. Yeah, interesting. Well, that is, I think, to your question, one of the things that will be ongoing for NBC OT in terms of looking at all the different types of tools that could potentially be developed. And whether or not, to your point, a tool might be developed that is more specific to the regulatory experience is something I can certainly bring back and share with my colleagues. There's just a vast array of different types of tools that could be developed because practice is changing all the time. So, I appreciate your question.
Thank you. I think it's a wonderful vehicle for that kind of information, and so I was just looking at more on the professional development side of things.
Yeah, you bet. I'll
Thank
bring
you.
that back.
Sean, I have a couple of questions, and they really come from a place of not completely knowing very much at all about NBCOT. So I want just a little bit of background, if I may.
bet.
Other than when I passed my exam, and I do plan to bring my R back. There's no issue there. It was a process of moving from one state to the next, but
Yeah.
in the 100th year, you will see that of our profession. More importantly, can you tell us how many people are on your board and what they're made up of in terms of professional OTs, non-professional?
Sure.
And the follow-up question to that is what is the background of the people who are designing these professional tools?
Yeah, you bet. So on the NBCOT's board of directors, there are currently 15 members of the board, and the board consists of occupational therapist registered, certified occupational therapy assistants, and members of the public. There are public members. We have several members of the public who are on the board. In terms of their backgrounds, it really does vary. So, for example, there are people who may have been involved in and/or currently involved in education, people who have background and experience with accreditation, people who've had background and experience with administration. You've got other folks who may be coming to the table with a background in field work. So really sort of a variety of different perspectives. And each of these folks, of course, it's important to point out, come from locations all over the country. So they literally, come from destinations and states all over the country.
So I have my OTR, and the NBC OT Navigator is available to me simply because I have my R with NBC, or do I pay an extra fee?
No. So, and this is a good question. Thank you for asking that. This is a value-added component of national certification, so there is no additional fee. Individuals who have maintained their certification status as an OTR or COTA have access to these tools at their leisure. There is no additional fee.
Go ahead. I have more, but go, please take over. I'll come back.
Well, I was
to it.
wondering who your technology, I mean, you have a technology partner who puts together the materials, and you mentioned it's updated constantly, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering, maybe constantly is, what does constantly mean? I mean,
Well,
in terms of,
So routinely, so from a content
Yeah, routinely.
perspective, we're looking at the content to ensure that it is reflective of current practice related to the type of tool that is being reviewed at the time. There are sort of, in response to your question, Richard, as well as yours, Denise, there's a team of occupational therapy practitioners who are specifically working on the content. And then, we do work with a company in terms of the technology to bring that to life, so to speak.
is that a California company or an Washington DC company?
I think it's on the East Coast.
We're just
yeah.
always looking out for our local economy.
Yeah,
And it looks very nice.
yeah.
The other question I had, or maybe this is more just a statement from a practitioner standpoint, not specifically the license board. But the type of practitioner I am, there are many people like me. For example, in my professional development, I'm always going to attend my state conference if I can and the funds are there. Secondly, I'm always going to attend my national conference if the funds are there. So those are areas where I already pick up some really good continuing education.
Absolutely.
What work are you doing with either our state or national associations? Is there crosswalking taking place? Is there collaboration? Is there any funding coming from NBC OT to our associations to develop these core? In the world of bundling, since the healthcare world's going to a place of bundling, and since NBC OT has the bigger arm, the bigger finances, how are you
Sure.
working to help bring us all together? Or
Sure.
do you see that happening?
Sure.
And do
Well-
you see any sort of funding to our state or national groups?
Well, I can tell you that NBC OT has funded, for example, the student conclave. Since the conclave,
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, was developed. So AOTA and NBC OT actually co-sponsor that, and funding from NBC OT is put forward appropriately to help sponsor that. So that's one example. NBC OT also lends significant financial funding to the American Occupational Therapy Foundation and its efforts around research. So I think the organization has made some significant financial contributions to the profession. I would also, in response to your question, say that the Navigator initiative is one in which, we talked about bringing added value, but specific to your question, it was a way in which the board of directors wanted to take resources and turn it around, making these tools available to certificants. So in looking at your question sort of from more of a certificate perspective, that's another way of then making that, sort of turning that around and putting those resources into that for the certificates.
And my comment, and this will be the last part, it's more of a clarifying, it really comes from a place of practicality. So for example, I know I'm going to attend my state conference. I know I have access, I have, even on their website, I can have my OT license. The AOTA has a very nice continuing ed piece that has, with the conferences now, it's kind of fun actually to sign up for these classes and give yourself points and all these things.
Yeah.
So if there's another place to put this NBC OT Navigator, I'm asking, have y'all gotten together and figured out a way to link up and make it work in practicality and financially for everybody so that from my standpoint, I can, wherever I choose to get my professional development, they link into each other and I don't have to have duplicate, siloed sort of services.
Are you talking more about the technology side of things, or? Because,
Yeah.
you know, one of the things that has also been done, and this has been in place now for quite some time, is that when you're looking at the professional development units, or in the case of the Navigator, the competency assessment units that are earned, when in working with AOTA over the years, the professional development units in general that are recognized by NBC OT for certification renewal purposes are recognized if they're accrued through AOTA. So for example, when an individual goes to the association's national conference and accrues professional development activity through attendance at the conference, those professional development units are awarded a 1.25 unit value, which is higher than all of the other activities. So that's a very practical example of a way in which NBC OT, I think, really tried to work with AOTA to make, to recognize what the association was putting forward and to assign it a higher level value.
Okay, I do have another question now. As we're leading up to the conference then, do you ever actually do outreach on that? Because that's pretty powerful.
You mean on that?
Yeah, to help get therapists to the conferences. I mean, they've become much more popular especially this year is very popular. But, you know, for example, let's say the one in 2018, I can't be sure about this, but for some reason I think it's in Utah. Is that right? Yeah, I'm kind of stoked about that. But the ones that, let's say, if I was a therapist that lived in that particular area who had never really gone to a conference, but I knew I was going to get higher PDUs, I might go to that conference. So that's a very interesting
Yeah.
way to help build. I'm really talking about building masses, making the entire profession of all occupational therapists across the United States very strong,
Yeah.
regardless of which association
Sure.
that we're all, you know.
Sure, absolutely.
Very strong contender because of what's happening in the political
Yep,
and the reimbursement world.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so that's all.
As somebody who's I've maintained my certification, and I remember the previous one of the previous iterations of the self-assessment tools that NBCOT had available, and I basically didn't really take advantage of them, didn't really use them, so I appreciate this presentation because this seems like something that I'll take another look at this because it seems more engaging, a little bit more engaging for me. The question I would have, and obviously before I wouldn't want to decide anything with regard to continuing competency until I see the relationship between how much of it is a competency building and how much of it is a self-assessment tool, because it seems like a way to get at I mean, on the one hand, it could be seen it's a source of developing a bibliography and further study, identifying areas for further study. The degree to which it actually builds skills in and of itself through as an activity is something that that remains to be seen. I would want to take a look at.
Yeah.
But there seem to be elements of both there.
Yes.
And before I would think this board there should be some more, I think, research into what the tool does and whether it really, to what degree it really would relate to a continuing education unit or a PDU from our perspective, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the entire experience is built on an initial self-reflection in terms of identifying for an individual, him or herself, what he or she thinks their areas of need are. If they're transitioning into a new setting, if they're transitioning to a new population, what are the kinds of things? How do they want to go about enhancing that knowledge or skill?
And
So
I
that
don't
sort of
believe-
lays the foundation.
And I don't
then-
believe that we really reward that with continuing competency credits in California, that type of activity. But
Yeah. Yeah, that's just sort of the initial, I mean, that's the only thing I wanted to make clear is that that's the sort of the initial foundation. And then from there, using the tools to help support that.
yeah. It's very interesting. I was impressed by the polish and content of the presentation.
Well, thank you.
Heather, did you have any comments?
Well, actually, I had a question. So the, what's the equivalency for a competency assessment unit relative to a PDU or a contact hour?
Yeah.
Is there like, I was looking for a chart online and I
Yeah.
just didn't find it.
So it is, actually, it's the same.
Okay, they are
So
equivalent.
they are equivalent. It's just the fact that there is a name or a title difference between the units
Okay.
accrued through the Navigator as opposed to any of the other 29 kinds of activities.
And did you say earlier that for certification renewal, that of the 30 PDUs required, or contact, whatever, units, I'll say, because there's so many ways to refer to them, that a maximum of 14 could be allowed from the Navigator tools towards their renewal?
That is correct.
Okay.
In a 3-year cycle.
Okay.
Now, if, I think one of the other important points of clarification is that for any board that were to consider accepting these, it's completely within the board's discretion to identify whether or not they want to place a limit or a cap on the number of units that they would recognize for partial fulfillment of meeting the state's continuing ed or competency requirement. So if you wanted to put a limit of 3 units per renewal cycle, we fully anticipate that how you choose, how the board chooses to implement it is completely up to the board.
How did you pick 14?
We really looked at our requirement in terms of 36 units and tried to look at the content of all of the different types of activities and then tried to weigh that out as fairly as we thought we could in terms of identifying what that cap or limit would look like. Now, this it launched in June of 2015, so it has been up and available for a little over a year now. So, of course, that's part of why we're doing this next study, is to really look at how the tools are being used, how people are responding to them. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at going forward as well. And I could see where, maybe some of that information may be useful in terms of, looking at even that. But we tried to really take as an objective approach as we could at trying to identify what that would look like coming out of the starting gate.
So is it possible for you to provide to Heather a list of those regulatory agencies that are currently using it in some form
Sure.
or fashion?
Sure.
So we can do a little bit of our own research, as Richard talked about
Yep.
what they see the strengths and weaknesses potentially are.
Sure.
So then we can maybe discuss it amongst ourselves. and-
Okay, yep,
That'd be great.
absolutely. Yep,
Thank you.
You bet.
I have a clarifying question, maybe to our legal, or to our ED. I just want to make sure I understand this. Any other institution that's submitting their courses for consideration for credits, there's a process for that. I mean, obviously. So how does this differ from that? Do we have specific language that prohibits this type of education model?
No, there's not language that prohibits it. The board does not approve continuing education providers except for those courses offered currently by OTAC or AOTA. However, there's a provision of the regs that talks about that it has to be objectively measurable in terms of the hours, and also it has to, one other thing, 41, so when people are audited, we do accept, one of the things is that the 1 hour for the self-assessment tool, I feel it's
Yep.
a professional requirement. If
Yeah.
you want, there, as mentioned yesterday, and I think under AOTA's continuing professional development, there's the comment that there are always those people who are going to wait till the end and rush and take anything they can just to meet the renewal requirement.
Yeah.
That being said, I feel that many people are very thoughtful in what they take in terms of either relating to their current practice or a practice area they want to go in. So what this board has asked, and this has just been a very busy year, we haven't had a chance, but because of the variation in the way NBC OT awards units and the way this board's regs calculates the units, that 1 hour assessment, is not something that the board would accept it, just wouldn't meet the current regs. And as you heard from yesterday, the regulatory amendment process and it is an extremely lengthy
Yeah.
year and a half, process.
Yeah.
But also, they have, this board is asked to eliminate the confusion on the part of the practitioner. Like Denise said, you have, NBC OT, AOTA, the board, all these different organizations. We've been asked, and we'll be doing this soon, doing a crosswalk and a comparison. Because, for example, folks who don't take the time to look at the California requirements for continued competence don't realize that when they do the volunteer work during the summer at the Children's Cancer Camp, that NBCOT does award them hours, and this board doesn't have a mechanism for that.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that people still will check NBCOT's website to find out what alternative ways that they can earn PDUs, but they aren't checking, the board's regulations. And so, and when there's a course where NBCOT awards a higher unit amount, if you will, because it's an advanced course, for example, and yet it was clearly, let's say, a 1-hour course and they earned 1.25 or 1.5, that has gotten some folks into trouble. And so I think it's very important that that we do put together this information for licensees. I'm not sure necessarily how many will tap into it, but at least, by putting it out there, and maybe the board could, put on its Facebook the link once it's there, for example, or send out a tweet reminding people. It might be helpful, because a lot of times folks will use the higher amount for their continuing education, then we have to point them back to the regs, and they end up not meeting the 24 that we require every 2 years.
Yeah.
So those are just some of my comments.
Sure.
I would then add to that, is there any way, you obviously have a pretty sophisticated technology team, and there is this confusion between what you award and what we recognize. There's a lot of scenarios in the world in which you put in what state you're from or whatever, and then it calculates based upon, let's say, sales tax, for example.
Right.
Your sales tax calculates what you pay based upon where you lived, even though you may be ordering it from somewhere else. Is it possible for you guys to go into your accreditation awarding of CE or PDUs or whatever you may be, and when a person puts where their license is held, it calculates and says, these are the units you would qualify for based upon the state in which you operate and live and you're licensed? That would be it would be helpful to us as well. And that would be for our friends at AOTA as well.
Yeah.
That'd be fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's, in the ideal world, I agree with you. I mean, that would be, amazing. But honestly, I don't think that's going to be practical for us, because their regulations, you know what I mean? Are
Sure.
changing. But I that would be.
But
Well,
to that note, to Jeff's point, if technology there could always be a statement added on your page before they sign out to make sure they check their state regulatory.
Well, and when we, so
Or
for
could there,
example.
I'm asking, not,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just going to say on our website now, to Jeff, your question earlier about the states that have currently accepted the tools, there is a statement on there that makes very clear that all regulatory requirements of any given state must always be met. That's definitely
There.
very clearly stated there.
I just remember 15 years ago when this board first started developing the regulations for continuing competency, our predecessors, and they aligned all the PDUs with the NBC OT, because you all had done such great work putting that all together and made it matched up just pretty much exactly with the 12 units per annum and similar kind of things, and how that was to avoid confusion for the members and to make it easier. And now that's pretty much just kind of changed a lot, and we can't keep we can't keep up with you nor from our mandate and our continuing competency.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we want to. But unfortunately, that's we have to communicate. We did try, I mean, this board did try 15 years ago to do that, but things are just moving in different directions, and there's seems to be no way around that, and we just have to communicate that to our licensees, and you may get some feedback at NBC OT among certificants as well.
Yeah,
That they wish we were, we could be more aligned.
yeah,
I'm just not sure that that's going to be something we're going to be able to do.
yeah.
If I can ask another question.
Yeah.
And on the NBCOT's website, there is a certification renewal activities chart, and it goes through the different navigator tools, so folks know in advance
Yep.
how many competence assessment units they can earn for that activity. Is there some sort of correlation with the time the user spends?
For the navigator tools?
Right, in terms of the value that's awarded.
Yeah.
So for example, with the mini quizzes, you mentioned earlier, there's 20 questions, and so it's a half of a unit. So
Right.
if there was a correlation with time, presumably it should take the user about a half an hour to answer 20 questions, is that?
Well, because it's an individual experience, what could take one individual 30 minutes might take another individual 45 minutes.
Or 6?
Or 6, because
Right.
they're all customized experiences based on the interface with the user. So there's not necessarily a time parameter that is affixed to each of the tools.
So if it's not a time, then how is it determined that, some earn, for example, 1 unit per case simulation
Sure.
versus a half a unit through the Pico problem intervention comparison? Now, I mean, so what,
Yep.
I mean, because right now the board's just, the reason I'm asking these questions is the board's regs, if it's not, mentioned, I was saying earlier, there's 2 requirements. It contributes directly to professional knowledge, skill, and ability, which this obviously does. But it also says the program or activity must be objectively measurable in terms of the hours involved. So that's why I'm trying to find out how this navigator, obviously our regulations are a little bit more restrictive, but I'm just trying to see if we could bridge that so the board members can then, make an informed decision.
Yeah. Well, and there isn't on our end with the navigator tools, there isn't a time component that's affixed to it because
Okay.
it is an individual user's experience.
Difficulty-based?
What's that?
Is it difficulty-based? I mean, there's a range of 0.5, a quarter, 1. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a number of different.
Yeah, and on our end, an individual, when they complete the tool, it's not based on the fact just that they complete it. I mean, there is behind the scenes, in terms of the way that the tool is set up from a technology perspective, there's like a minimum threshold that has to be met in order for the
In terms of
user-
accuracy?
Exactly.
Okay.
In terms of the individual having a successful experience as opposed to not. Some of the tools, for example, if there are multiple attempts made in which a tool is not successfully completed, then there are a few of the tools in which the user would no longer have access to them. Because it's really meaning
Skill-based.
that type of tool.
It's sort of intuitive based on the
Exactly.
user, so that if I keep trying to do maybe more advanced simulations and my clinical skill set isn't there, they wouldn't be available to me until I was able to successfully complete some of the other more intermediate or basic ones?
Yeah,
Is
they
that-
may be, in other words, so for example, with a case simulation, if they try up to 3 times and they're still unsuccessful, that particular tool may no longer be available to them, but there would be, another type of simulation tool that they could try. So you saw in the video, for example, where there might be a simulation tool around mental health. If somebody tried that up to 3 times and they were unsuccessful, they might then be able to try another type of simulation tool to be able to build knowledge and skill. But to your initial question, there is a minimum threshold that's built into the system that has to be met in order to achieve a successful outcome.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to, I know, this is a technology-based proposal that you guys have created that people want to take advantage of. And with that, I know that there's the challenges of linking with every state, but if there's an interest, it can be done, just like there's an interest of updating current and, new opportunities and skills and techniques, right? So there's a way to have somebody, that same team can manage and monitor. Let's use the same thing with the time versus, if somebody's actually, that's providing, I would imagine, feedback to you as well as to the person participating on the online test.
Yeah.
And if you can find that the average person is taking 29 minutes to take that test, where there may be some higher, or some are lower, but you're looking at the mean,
Yeah.
there's a way to be able to say that in an average person, this is this much time. Because if you look at the way mechanics do, bid on your card at work.
Yeah.
Whether you're a utility person and you're gonna, the length of time it should take you to be able to complete an order that's been done by a customer. Time is set not by everybody's, but what the average is.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so I think that would be helpful to us if we could figure out what each one of these little skills tests that you're doing, what the average OT or the OTA would need to do this, and then we could go back and potentially legitimately say, we're basing this upon about the average. Some will take much longer, and unfortunately they're not going to get extra points because it took them an hour and a half to do what a typical 30-minute class would be. But the person who is able to get through it in 7 minutes because they have such an, they connect so well to it, they understand it. I don't know that we would want to, or I'd have to see if we could, but I don't know that we would want to hamper their ability as their, if Einstein could do something in 5 minutes that everybody else takes, 100 years, should we penalize them
Yeah.
for taking 5 minutes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But we need some standard of, time.
In terms of time. Yeah.
That's very challenging in technology, though, because people watch television while they do these things. They play a video game during them. I mean, people have divided attentions. They get phone calls. And it's not a classroom setting. Even in classroom settings, we have difficulty getting people to avoid doing other work at the OTEC, when you go to classes. So, I mean, I know at Kaiser we have quite an extensive array of tools for training that are similar in the format, at least electronic format, and they do tend to have an estimated time that it will take. I think many other larger institutions have those, and then they have an estimated time that is based on something, but I'm not really sure what it's based on, and I'm not really sure what this is
Right. And
based on either.
Right. I think the discussion, Mr. Farrow hit it right on the head, is that at the end of the day, with the regs saying what they say, any kind of data you would have that would have a comparison from a time component would be helpful,
Sure.
considering all those factors.
Yeah.
And we could reevaluate some of the classes at conference and say, well, people are on their laptops. Why are we giving full credit? Those are those nuances
Sure,
that'll
yeah.
always be there.
Sure.
So I think just having data in
Yeah.
whatever way, shape, or form that can give us a comparable with existing reg
Okay.
would allow us to move forward in at least discussion and consideration. In absence of that, we would have to move forward in discussing any kind of change to our existing structures.
Okay. No, that's, that, I appreciate, your questions and your comment in that regard, and I can certainly bring that back to the office in terms of hearing you all say that this information in its aggregate format would be something that would be constructive and beneficial in terms of helping you make an informed decision based on the way your regulations are written. So I would be happy to bring that back.
That said, we have one continuing competence change this year that we've been working on all year, based on aligning the fieldwork supervision hours, the hours PDUs have awarded for fieldwork supervision with NBC OTs at the and that's from a formal request by our fieldwork educators in California that came, I think, in July of 2015.
November 2014.
Oh, November 2014, sorry. So, and the regulation, we talked about it yesterday, is scheduled, it's finally been sent to the Department of Consumer Affairs last month,
Yeah.
and the final package is due to to OAL next June. So, I mean, we're talking about,
It's a long,
so, I mean,
3 years.
we are kind of respond to the demands of our licensees, because, and then we're subject to some other
Sure.
forces here. So I'm not in a big hurry to make a change, to make this change without, it's a fairly new program, and it's a big process for us.
yeah.
So personally, I'm not even comfortable putting it on the agenda anytime soon for a future meeting. So and there's no rush for me.
Okay.
Maybe other board members feel differently about that.
But I think any speed with which we can start to get
Yes.
data is important to us.
It's helpful,
Because when
yeah.
Heather gets that, she can make it available for review, not for action. And when we feel we have something sufficient, then we can make it.
Right, and I agree that, and I differ from that. I really do believe there is a rush, not necessarily because of this specific technology, but just in general, the way just business and industry is moving forward. I think having any kind of remote or virtual type of component is the way we're going in the next 3 to 5 years, easy. So if it is going to be a 2-year process to make any changes, whether it be for this tool or others, we need to have that conversation sooner rather than later. So that's why I'm looking at, if a data component can look at our existing regs and maybe we can decipher maybe it's a lower value, but we accept it, so be it. That helps us move forward quicker. But I think long term, this is the way this is going in the industry that I'm from. I'm a public member, but this is the way we're doing our virtual training as well, and it really is going to be the way we're moving forward.
Sean, if,
Well, I was just, I mean, because I have two very different comments right here, and so I would just ask maybe that the board consider if NBC OT is able to meet this, is put it on the March agenda. And because people are turning in the certificates that are completing this, and if you have 15,000, users, I mean, I suspect it will be increasing. And also due to the point that it takes so long, so that even if the board did decide to do something in March, you're still looking at a fall 18, effective date, again, with how long the regs take. So just in terms of collecting data and getting some traction. So fortunately, the folks that have done this, for the most part, are people who they have 45 hours. So that 1 hour self-assessment deduction doesn't hurt them. The 4 hours volunteer or 4 units based on the volunteer work, doesn't hurt them.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the case for everyone.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel it's a disadvantage, to the profession, especially for those who still aren't looking at what the board's requirements are, but, are reviewing yours.
and we're actually, we actually have similar thoughts on this particular thing in terms of the timeline because of the two different responses. But my question to you, Sean, would be, do you see, I have it more like in my mind like a June agenda than a March, but, whatever it's going to be is whatever the board wills. Do you see that much difference between the feedback we're giving you today and what you're hearing? What would be so different about what you would present in March? Will you link in the technology? Okay, I'm kidding on that. Just for kicks and
Yeah.
giggles. But what would look different based on this feedback for,
Sure. Well, I think that, and I'm not really able to answer this here. I definitely have to go back and talk to our CEO about the request that's been raised here in terms of whether or not it might be possible to provide aggregate data in terms of use of time or a time applied to use of these tools. That's the one thing, I will definitely bring that back. But to your question, Denise, in terms of what would be different, I mean, if we were able to provide something like that, that could be a different piece of information. There might also be some additional updates around the study that's being done, that we talked about toward the end of the presentation, this 2-year study. I don't know for sure if there will be any additional outcomes coming out of that study by June, but that's another question, that I can certainly follow up on and see if there would be any updates from there. The only other thing would be, that I can think of, would be if there are, by that time, new tools. You saw where there were 2 new types of tools that are currently being developed. I can look at what their timeline is for implementation, and whether or not that would be an opportunity for updated information on those tools. But that's all speculative,
so you'll be in touch with Heather
sure.
about that?
Yeah,
Sure.
what if we, and then
You'll be in touch and you'll figure it out and we'll go from there.
Yeah.
maybe in March we can talk about putting on a future agenda based on the time
Uh-huh.
line that.
Because you probably, as a company, have your own development in 2017 that you knows how. Okay, so
Yeah.
please, we're very grateful that you took the travel time to join us this
Absolutely.
December, and the question comes from a place of making it value added for everybody.
Absolutely.
In March,
Absolutely.
we'll be at San Jose State, and in June, we'll be at West Coast University, Los Angeles.
Okay. Well,
Where do you fly from? I'm just curious.
from DC,
Oh,
because our office is in Gaithersburg, Maryland, so from one of the 3 airports in that area.
okay.
So,
All right. Other questions?
No, I just think,
Comments?
I would like to move it on an agenda, whether that be March, June, whenever, just so it's there as a placeholder, because I think having an opportunity for public comment may may sway whatever direction we're going in and I'm looking at March as well, just because we're already having the conversation about CEUs. I just think it's important to have placeholders and to move forward and have that discussion.
Okay.
That's
So we are sort of weaving into item on the agenda 18, just so you know, and we can certainly hold that for that purposes and come back, or we can make a decision. Heather, do you want to take over the direction on this? Do you want to close down the discussion on this and where it's on an agenda?
No, I don't want to
Okay.
close down the discussion. I just would ask that we'd be able to, that I could work with Sean over the next few months and that it be on the
Absolutely.
March agenda, just,
As a placeholder, yeah.
Even if it's moved, right?
yeah. I mean, maybe there's not a decision, but at least there's a conversation and a review, and if, I feel like March would be good.
Okay.
Ileana, we have a consensus. You don't need a motion on something like that, right? Okay, so work with Heather. Heather will advise, and we'll go from there.
I have some more ideas too about information maybe that would be helpful to them, so.
Okay.
I'll be in touch with you next week.
sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your time and consideration. Again, we really do appreciate the opportunity to come before you to share this information. So we are greatly appreciative of the invitation and the opportunity to be here, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have had a request from, we do have public comment. Sean, you might want to, we have public comment that might,
Sorry.
Sure, Chuck Homeworth from AOTA, and, and we are following these developments in the states, and I've been traveling around to other states, and Sean has given this presentation. And I just want to make a couple remarks. We don't oppose the Navigator, just to be clear about that, but we are concerned about how states are adopting the Navigator. And we want to make clear, in our view, that states should have a variety of professional development activities that can be used for licensure renewal. And this new system creates, in our view, a different type of category, which would be competency development, or come up with some other type of activity. That this isn't an online course, this isn't a self-study, it's not a home study program. And we've seen some state regulatory boards look at their regulations and say it fits here, and they're done with it. And we think that, particularly in California, looking at your regulations, that here's the board, and it sounds like you're going to do it, take a look at your regulations and see how this fits in, or what the alternatives might be. We recognize that the rulemaking process is long and difficult, but ultimately, it would be good to have regulations are clear to consumers, to licensees, and to the associations and to others about what is acceptable continuing education in competence professional development activities. And ideally, it would be nice to have a category that says competency assessment, here are the documentation requirements, here are any limitations on the category, and this is what you must submit. In the absence of that, I'm concerned that one, folks won't know what is acceptable or not. Two, that other entities, such as AOTA, state associations, other course providers, won't know that competency assessment is an accepted activity in California, that they can develop competing products. So if only NBC OT is recognized, we are concerned that will go unaddressed. We urge the board to give that careful consideration as you move forward. We'd be pleased to come back in March and lend our perspective. We think it's important that licensees in California are aware of the discussions. Appreciate that this is being live streamed so folks can become aware of the issue. This does fit in some ways with what we talked about yesterday, that we believe that continuing professional development is a process, that you do a self-assessment, that you do a professional development plan, and then you go on to get continuing education, competence, skills developments, whatever the case may be. I guess we do differ with the board. We think that a self-assessment should be given some credit. There should be a carrot there for going through that process so that you go through the thoughtful process of doing a professional development plan, that you're not just taking things at the last minute. So that concludes my comments. Be happy to join the discussion again in March, and appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Conway, for this presentation. Just a few opening things I want to say on behalf of the association and myself as an individual. As a license holder with this board and as a certificate holder since 1991, my initial exam, I value the role of the NBC OT. I obviously choose to maintain my certificate because I value what it represents. I have taken great time myself as an individual certificate holder to understand all the differences that were alluded to earlier. I've been audited when I renewed with the NBC OT, which was also a fascinating process to kind of go through. I'm happy to say I was ready and had my paperwork in order. Got through it pretty easily. And so I'm aware, going through the audit as well as just renewing, I'm aware of what I can claim for my renewal with the NBC OT versus the licensing board. For instance, in that audit process, OTAC kindly put together a record of my attendance at board meetings as a board member, and that counts.
Yeah.
And to be perfectly honest, I'm so passionate about my volunteer service to the association and other entities that I thank the NBC OT for acknowledging it and giving me credit for it. I think that is illustrative of all of us as various entities, the associations, the two of them, the licensing board, and what you represent with the NBC OT. I think all of us really are on the same team, and to that end, you know, again, I thank you for what's provided. I do want to say that I've, in the last 7 to 8 years, been the provider of a session at OTAC's annual conference and spring symposium, very often in collaboration with Heather Martin, the executive officer here, to go over who all these groups are, what they represent as primary agendas, protecting the public, advancing the profession. I see the NBC OT as sitting in between those things, actually, because of the initial exam and then all these value-added benefits. So I've taken on quite a bit of responsibility personally within the state of California to educate on this content. I even have a number of slides on Navigator. I go on it every year before I present to be clear I know what's current with it, etc. But I do want to add to President Miller's content earlier about your interaction with the state associations. I do wish to add that it's been unfortunate, and I'm not sure the reason why, that the NBC OT hasn't been at our conferences in the last 7 years or so. I would like to formally invite you to return to us. I really think your visibility in collaboration with us is necessary for the advancement of professional quality of service provision, which ties directly to the protection of the public, those who receive our service provision. So I do wish to see the NBC OT a little more directly collaborative with the state through the association. If I may extend that to you.
No, absolutely.
I think it's been a little bit of a misfortune for our members and practitioners in the state that you haven't been with us the last several years. I was happy to provide the information to the best of my capacity, but please return if you can chat with the NBC OT about that.
Okay.
And beyond that, I think the Occupational Therapy Association is 100% in line with the views of the AOTA, or what's been shared from the AOTA by our Director of State Affairs. So I do think there's a distinct difference in self-assessment and the rigors thereof. You know, I've spent a number of years in graduate school and in academia, and of course I'm influenced by those processes, but the profession's moving forward at a rapid rate, and I think actually you're acknowledging that by building this very sophisticated tool. But I do think it's always helpful to consider the spectrum of educational needs, and that the threshold should move accordingly. And so some things can be achieved online, not everything can be achieved online, but I think Mr. Wilmarth has articulated that better than I am currently, and I just want to say that our association is behind the views of the AOTA at this point in terms of re-examining the categorization of continuing education offerings and how those credits would be claimed, et cetera. So, but please return to us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
You know, and if I may, for Chuck, you know, in response to your comments as well as to yours, you know, I just want to share with everyone that in terms of the language that Chuck is talking about, developing new language that would create a new section in regulations around continuing competence, If that's something that the board chooses to do, NBC OT would be in full support of that. You know, and I want to make sure that everyone knows that. And, you know, in terms of interfacing with the state association, I definitely will bring back to the office your interest and your invitation. I know that the last 2 years, I think, in terms of sort of spreading our staffing resources around the country, we hadn't come, because I think I forget exactly how many years in a row, something like 7 years in a row, I think we had come to the California conference. So at any rate, just to share with you that is a big part of the reason why it was really looking at allocating our staffing resources, trying to make it as fair and equitable as possible to other associations, because you know how busy the fall season is.
Yes.
But that said, I'll definitely bring your invitation and your request back. Absolutely.
Thank
bet.
you. Please know we have an annual event in March also every year.
Yeah,
I'm serious, just in case the fall is really too crowded.
yeah.
I
Good point.
I
That's a good
respectfully
point.
offer that.
That's flexibility. I do have a question back for Chuck, because Chuck made a comment.
And Pam also has a question as well.
Just back, because I didn't get a chance. I know you referenced that you think that the self-assessment is valuable. We're not here to talk about that, but I'd like to know more about your thoughts on this. Is that you talk about it being a carrot. Are you thinking about any time within the qualifying period for certification? Or are you thinking about at the beginning of your period, so that way you could then add the CEs and the PDUs that would allow you, versus putting it in at the end of the time just to get a quick couple of units?
Okay, so that's a good point, and I guess I was thinking, you know, about the OT or the OTA that has the best intentions in mind, that they would start out a new renewal cycle with a self-assessment rather than the person that has to get one CE in the last week. You don't want to do a self-assessment at the end, so that's a good point, and that's not something I considered. You know, AOTA has a model continuing competence guideline, and for, I think, geez, it's been 10 years or more, where we put that in there, that's an optional provision, that if you complete this and you attest that you did it, and you did a plan, that you should get a point for it. And I think only a handful of states have taken us up on it, but I think it would be helpful to motivate folks to go through that more thoughtful process. So good point.
I'm just trying to get some clarification. Thanks.
Yeah, Pam Richardson. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of NBC OT. I'm also an educator at San Jose State University, and wanted to offer a couple points relative to the development of the tool of the Navigator. Was involved in that entire process as a member of the board, and I think we were aware at the time as a board that this really did represent a different paradigm of professional development. To Chuck's point, I think it's a very valid point that this is different. It is not, you know, the traditional mode of doing professional development, and as such, you know, doesn't easily fall into some of the existing categories that we have for professional development activities. I think that's an excellent point of discussion. One thing that we did do relative to the questions about time value for the different activities, during the beta testing of the Navigator, we did get data on average amounts of time that people took for the different activities. And that was used by the board to determine the CAU values. And at the time, we were very conservative about awarding those. You know, we really kind of looked at that very closely. And now that it's out and available, I would hope that additional data would become available that would, you know, allow the board and others to kind of look at that information and make a judgment about what's an appropriate award for that. And also from a qualitative perspective, kind of my educator hat, in relationship to the personal assessment piece of the professional development platform, it really lines up with education and OT, what we're aiming to do with occupational therapists in education, to make them reflective and critical thinkers. And that's certainly something that we build into our educational programs. The ACOTE standards for our programs emphasize that as well. So we felt in developing that piece that it really created a seamless process for our new therapists, the students who are graduating out of OT programs and going into their life of continued competency and professional development, that it kind of created or maintained that value that we had in terms of becoming a reflective practitioner and using that to be strategic and careful in terms of planning what your professional development activities are going to be over time and how they might change over time. And we certainly also viewed this, as Sean has said several times, as an option. We've never viewed it as the only option for professional development. And, you know, certainly I'm an AOTA member my entire career. I've been an OTAC member since I've lived in California. I go to the OTAC conference every year. I go to the AOT conference. And I wouldn't stop doing those things as a result of participating in some of these online professional development activities. That's my comments.
I'd just like to say that, you know, I think there's a difference between thinking and doing. And we're not used to giving credit for thinking. We're used to credit for doing in the hospital, in the healthcare world. And in the academic world, it's a different thing. So I really need to think more about this before doing anything about it.
Also, Pam, by the way, thanks for those comments and specifically pointing out that how the process of time played in. That answered a few questions up here. Also, one thing I would put out there is it's also very hard when we're reading, like, for example, the AOTA one. How do you put the word, let's just go here, CPD as a self-directed reflective process of lifelong learning? How do we regulate around reflective? How do we do that?
Well, model regulations from AOTA will spell that out. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I think that part of it is going to be up to the practitioner to do that. And some of this you can't regulate. But what you can regulate would be, you know, similar to, I mentioned Colorado yesterday, that there is a template that's out there that guides someone through a process, and they have to provide responses, and they cue them on different areas. And so I encourage the board to take a look at what was developed, and it's extensive materials on the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. They have a whole lengthy manual about the process, and see how they led people through it. I mean, some of this you can't mandate, you can't regulate, but I think you can provide a pathway, you know, and light it up and put signs on it to point people in the right direction, rather than what I've said before, which is checking the boxes. And I think that the process has to get beyond checking the boxes and provide some guideposts, guide rails to help folks go through a better process. And, you know, if it would be helpful to provide some regulations and some language around that, we'd be happy to develop it.
And so being very mindful of that, how you've just described that, which is really the association's job to do that, not a regulatory board. But be that as it may, I want to keep in mind, really, all I'm just looking for is some validation. I think it goes without saying, Chuck, and maybe overstating, but it's on the minds of the people who are developing this material that you're drawing that pathway to help those of us who are simply looking for, you know, our charge is protection of the consumer, and if these courses meet the threshold of providing practitioners that are going to be great practitioners out there, then that's what we're going for. And so it's on the minds of you as the developers of this to create something that we will be able to implement, help our practitioners, right?
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, it wasn't, did you want to add anything more?
I'm obviously I'm not in a decision-making capacity, but I mean, I do appreciate these tools. And even though right now they don't fit neatly into the regs, one of the things I do believe is that they are consistent with the regs that allow alternative ways to earn PDUs for different activities, whether it's supervising a student, whether it's publishing an article. You know, I mean, there are a number of different ways, and I think the board, even though it was modeled after NBC OT's regs, you know, years ago, I do think the board is interested, just by the current set of regs, in recognizing alternatives so that practitioners don't just have to sit in a classroom. They can do it online, you know, they can do it a number of ways, and I feel like this is an alternative way, and it does fit neatly within what the board's regs are going towards in terms of a policy of availability of alternatives. I just want to
The Navigator tool itself?
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And then the comments to Chuck Wilmark were this particular item, that's where we were tying it in, this particular item that you presented about yesterday, being mindful of how it can be implemented and utilized from a CEU standpoint by practitioners. Okay.
So March addendum.
So Heather will be in touch with you. Sean, do we have any more public comments? Okay. So I have had a request from some of the board members to have a very short and quick break, so we are going to do that. The time is now 10:55. If we could all be back here by 11:05. We have a few things on our agenda that we need to discuss, and then we will close the meeting down. Thank you. It's 9:55. We're taking a break. 10. Hi, I'm going to license portability because Chuck Wilmark wants to leave. Okay, we are coming back together. It's 11:07 a.m. We are moving on to agenda item 17, discussion and possible action on proposed national policy regarding license portability. Heather, if you could provide a brief report, please.
The board may recall that this item is being considered by the American Occupational Therapy Association. This has been a watch item, and so it's been on the agenda pending any outcome or update from AOTA.
Do we have any outcome or update from AOTA?
Chuck Wilmarth with AOTA, as I presented yesterday, AOTA is going to convene a licensure portability stakeholder meeting before AOTA's annual conference on the Wednesday before conference and the dates escaping me.
March
29th. March 29th, very good, from 2 to 5 p.m. And I believe we sent out a postcard to all the state board members and staff announcing that event. We're going to send out a formal invitation. We welcome you to attend, and essentially it's going to be regulatory board members, staff, state association leaders, NBC OT representatives, employers, and others, and we're going to have a discussion about what licensure portability might look like for occupational therapy, what other health professions are doing. Coleman Eldridge from the Council of State Governments, who runs the operation that does the compacts, will be there to talk about what is a compact, what other compacts are in process. We're going to bring in somebody from we've invited someone from the National Council for State Boards of Nursing to talk about the nurse compact. So that is the update that we have. We did issue, ad hoc committee did put a report together that's been issued. The representative assembly or governance entity endorsed the idea of licensure portability, including a compact. So if you don't have the report that was created, I'm happy to convey that, but that's the latest information that I have.
Perfect. So we can have further discussion, or we can also just be mindful that there's not much more to discuss until the AOTA conference. We kept this as a placeholder on our agenda, just to remind everybody, knowing that there were a lot of moving parts, but knowing that also this board, by having it as a placeholder, could be active when the time comes, as we're needed to weigh in as a stakeholder. It sounds like that time's not coming till March, which means we're probably looking at a June.
I'll make a motion, if possible, to put it on the June calendar for reconsideration.
Who wants to second?
Second.
Public comment.
So if you would just take roll.
I think you gotta do public comment, don't you?
Richard Bookwalter, I say yes. Jeff Farrow?
I will.
Do we need to take public comment before we make?
We are going to take, yes. Are there any public comment? Okay. We'll
Okay.
continue the.
Richard Bookwalter, I say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, and thank you for that update, Chuck. Okay, moving on to the next item. I do want to, if we could just go back for a point of order to yesterday's agenda, where the item 10 regarding consideration and possible action related to proposed regulatory language, filing of addresses. We have had an update that we just want to quickly revisit from yesterday, and who wants to give the report on that? Heather, Ileana?
Yesterday, the board approved the filing of address language with some edits and also added the language to incorporate the name change form by reference. One of the things we didn't have was the actual form, so Ileana's provided not only the existing name change request form that the board currently requires, and also the data requested matches that is currently asked in Breeze. And the only difference is the addition of the collection of personal information on page 2 is not with the existing form. So I'm basically asking for the board to have a motion to approve the form incorporated by reference into the section 4102. Of course, unless as part of your review, you have some suggested edits to the form.
And you approve the board, Heather, correct?
I approved the form.
And Ileana, you are okay with the wording on the form?
Yeah, I have no issues with the form.
Okay, so,
I'm confused. I thought yesterday we voted to incorporate the reference to this document.
But the board would need to approve the form, just to at least put their eyes on it and say, yes, this is the form we
This
want
is
to
the
use.
document.
And so, just to kind of speed up the process, here's the form now, so we can, you guys can look at it
okay
and
with
decide.
And there was a revision to the form in terms of adding the language, right, the notice?
Right, we'll change the revision date and add the collection of personal information notice
Yeah.
that's on the back. We will add that.
Because that's not on the current,
That's
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, and that's a legal requirement that we have to have. But otherwise,
Sure.
the form has not been changed at all.
so do we have a motion?
I move that we adopt the name change request form as presented, including the notice of collection of personal information on page 8.
I second.
And if we could take roll.
Public comment?
Do we have public comments on the form that we're adding? Okay.
All right, I say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
Okay, agenda item number 18, suggested agenda items for a future meeting. Heather, do you want to provide us?
As a reminder, some of the future items include adding the navigator to the March agenda, having the field work, the renewal, consideration of the renewal date for those changing their license from inactive to active status, which was approved at the October 27th meeting. The, it was from yesterday, just 1 second. The continuing education, consideration, eliminating the requirement for first-time renewers or some variation thereof, reviewing and updating the administrative manual, the disciplinary resource manual, the board's disciplinary guidelines, the ad hoc committee's recommendation regarding the physically invasive components of the swallowing evaluation, and some committee appointments.
Okay, so,
I'm so sorry, and then the strategic plan, as well as the strategic plan, action plan, status update.
also, we would have a report from AOTA regarding the ad hoc on the field work as a follow-up from yesterday. All those items that you listed, do we have to take a vote for, do they all have to show up on March? Do we have to go through that level of detail now, or do we?
They won't. A few meetings ago, when the list was much longer, you did, the board delegated to me the discretion to work with the board president to determine March versus June. That was in the board meeting minutes. So right now, I mean, unless somebody has a specific request other than, I did write down NBC OT Navigator for, March, but other than that, it's, we consider a number of things.
Great. I was actually going to remove items at a suggestion, but I don't have to go
Oh.
through that.
If you would like to.
No, I don't have to do that unless, because I don't have to do that now. Does any other board member have any?
I'm sorry, James, when you say remove items, I thought these items were voted for consideration for future board meetings. Are you talking about just moving them from different dates?
No, for example, we were given, actually, my understanding, as Heather just outlined, is Heather is going through all the minutes, how she comes up with these future items. She goes through all the minutes and looks at the discussion of where the board goes. For example, ad hoc committee's recommendations regarding occupational therapists performing the physically invasive components of swallowing. I also thought that we agreed that we're not going there. The ad hoc, we aren't going there with that because that is not our particular role on that matter. We know that our state association, we know that AOTA is identifying a position paper. They would help us to, or they would help the practitioner to create the bulk of the evidence surrounding our role in that, and they would outline and define that, and then we would look at that from a consumer protection standpoint.
Well, actually, as the person who had head of the ad hoc committee about that, it was the board actually sent it back to the ad hoc committee, but we haven't been able to meet, and then there have been some of the members of the ad hoc committee have become officers of OTAC, and that's made it a little bit complicated. So it's still kind of in this limbo. We probably should put it on the agenda. Just we would need to consider, if we're going to close it out, we would need to consider that on a future agenda. So I think we would need to.
understand. So
So we can't really take it off without a vote of the board. I think.
Correct.
We can move it.
So I understand, we haven't done that already?
No.
Because of there were committee meetings held in the summer, but then we were going into the sunset report preparation. And so the board asked that there be no more committee
it.
meetings until the sunset committee was finished. And then January, we started. kind of
So we
new-
do need to revisit it in the context that Vice President Bookwater identified. That makes sense.
And also the occupational analysis will also be on that next agenda also. So we talked about it yesterday from a budget perspective, but since it wasn't on the agenda as a standalone item, that will need to be also on that March agenda.
Okay. Okay, so, so other than that, would we also continue that the executive director would work with the board president to,
Yes,
okay,
to craft that next meeting agenda to see what'll make it and what'll have to go to June.
okay. Any other items that the board would like to see on the agenda? Do we have any comments from our public regarding future agenda items? Okay, all right, so there is no action or motion taken on that particular item, and if there's no further discussion, we are going to move on to item 19. Item 19 is the election of the officers. Heather, if you could provide some frame around this.
So the board's administrative manual requires the election of officers to take place at the first meeting of the year with an effective date, the first of the following calendar year. And what's been done in the past is that the three offices of president, vice president, and secretary can either be taken individually or they can be taken as a slate. It's the board's pleasure which direction they want to go.
Well, I am not, my term ends December 31st. I'll be in a grace period year if no one else is appointed or if I'm reappointed. So I'm not sure what that, should I bow out, as an officer at this time because of that? Or is it could I serve until something happens. I mean,
That's what has happened in the past.
in the past.
Because sometimes the appointments process is, a little bit more lengthy and doesn't necessarily occur by the December 31st deadline because of that one-year grace period.
And then if someone were to depart the board in mid-year, they would just, at
There's
that time,
There's a provision for the board to hold elections for that
For that.
vacant position.
thank you.
Are we able to make a recommendation? If Board Member Sharon Pavlovich is not here, and she's currently our secretary, and if there was unless, Mr. Bookwalter, was your question was in relation to continuing as vice president, or were you considering president?
I was considering, we should probably nominate, but I was thinking of just, if I could continue to be vice president until, into the grace period year.
Sure.
Or next year, or any office for that matter, as someone unappointed, but someone whose appointment is up.
And so therefore, and that's how I took his question, so what I was trying to understand is if there's a nomination or there's further discussion or there were to be part of that a slate, presented as a slate, can we present the slate, the board member who's not here?
Yeah, I'll just so you know.
Do you understand what, to
Yes,
continue as secretary?
Yes. And unfortunately, Sharon did not reach out to me and say one way or another if she was interested or was, not interested. So I have no feedback on her continuing in that capacity.
If she was nominated and we were so to elect and she were to decide later that this wasn't, I wanted something, would it be the same scenario in which somebody would vacate? That we would have to have a special election on that one?
Position of
Yeah,
secretary if she
yeah,
didn't want it.
right.
That's a good question, let me see. Yeah, continue your conversation while I look it up.
Does someone besides Denise want to step forward to be president? Does anybody?
You do.
I'm happy. Anybody? I'm happy with the current slate of officers. I'm one of them, but.
Any feedback from board members on this side regarding nomination, slate, anything?
Change is good, but not necessary if everything's working, so.
So someone,
As soon as we get the response from Ileana, then I can make a recommendation that we move the slate. But until I
Alright.
have that clarification, I'm not gonna make that motion.
the answer's gonna be yes. It's gonna be
Give us a moment
I
to
don't see it in
reflect.
the board member administrative manual, although.
There might be a BMP code section.
it's gonna be yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point, but if it is missing, that'd be something to remember to add when the manual's being reviewed.
Yes.
Which it is on the agenda to be reviewed. How convenient.
I mean, there's no indication in the Business Professions Code or in the board member manual regarding if somebody wants to resign their position and they decide they don't want it, you would just fill the vacant position as usual. I don't think that, unless the board has an issue with doing that, and I don't know how Sharon's gonna feel about being nominated without having thrown her hat in the ring, but that's a whole other issue. But if that's what the board, moves to, and, votes to appoint her as secretary again, then you can go ahead and do that, but with the knowledge that she may not want it, and then you'll have to do another vote, but.
Right. I'll make a motion that we move the existing officers for an additional year of service, and with the understanding that should Officer Pavlovich decide that she no longer wants to serve, that we will reopen for that one position.
Public comment before you guys vote?
Do we have any public
Well, there's not a
comment?
second yet.
Yeah.
I'll second.
Seconds from, any public comment? Okay. You want to take a vote?
Oh, yes. Richard, I'll say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa? Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
And so it begins. All right.
Congratulations. Do we
Madam
swear at them
President,
today or do we swear at them
congratulations,
later?
Madam President.
Your choice.
Next meeting, probably when Sharon will be here?
More, as we get ready for an adjournment, I just want to remind our public, and I just want to take an opportunity to wish our entire board and our practitioners in the state of California, you know what, and we'll even go so far as to involve the consumer in that, to extend a very happy and warm holiday to the people that we serve and to the people who are our licensees. I think it has been an extremely productive year for this board. A special thanks to our executive director, to our legal counsel, to our board staff that have attended so many meetings with us, 18 in fact this year, between ad hoc teleconferences, in-person meetings. But we accomplished a great deal together, and we want to, as an entire board, extend our thanks to all of the people that help us to rise up. So we're very grateful for that. With that said, we want to go ahead and adjourn this meeting for the California Board of Occupational Therapy on Friday, December 9th at 11:28 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.